Hello and welcome to lecture number 34. This is topic 2.23, the Civil War in Black Communities. The first learning objective is to describe enslaved and free African American men's and women's contributions during the United States Civil War. After the war broke out in April 1861, black volunteers to fight in the war were initially rejected. It wasn't until the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in September 1862 and a finalized effective version in January 1863 that they were authorized to enlist. Ultimately, nearly 200,000 black Americans served in the Union during the Civil War. Many of them were ex-slaves from the South who created regiments that were segregated. The 1st South Carolina Volunteers was organized after the Union captured territory in South Carolina. Further down south, the Louisiana Native Guards initially organized to fight for the Confederacy, but then they regrouped in 1862 to fight for the Union Army. Freemen in the North, after the Emancipation Proclamation, were recruited to fight in segregated regiments. The most famous one is the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, known for its assault on Fort Wagner. The Union's use of black soldiers was partly influenced by the success of the earlier black regiments like the Massachusetts 54th, which helped to change public perception about the capabilities of black soldiers. The valor displayed by the 54th Massachusetts Regiment at Fort Wagner helped to earn the respect and recognition for black soldiers, contributing to further enlistments. Once the 54th started to fill up, they created the 55th Massachusetts Regiment and the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. The purpose of this was for black Americans to advance abolition and the notion of black citizenship. Abolitionists saw a clear link between the defeat of the Confederacy and ultimate emancipation and citizenship for all, which is why they were so eager to enlist as soon as the war broke out. The roles they performed while serving the Union sometimes depended on gender. Men were initially used as builders before they were officially allowed to join as soldiers. General Butler's contraband argument stated that any enslaved person in the South who crossed into a Union camp could be used by the Union Army and should not be returned to their enslaver. Through Butler's logic, these people were considered confiscated property that, if returned, could help the enemy fight the Union. Additionally, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 no longer applied after the Confederacy seceded from the United States. Congress followed up with the Confiscation Act, which allowed the Union to hold on to enslaved people and keep them from being returned to their enslavers. The Confiscation Act was a significant step in undermining the institution of slavery and encouraging more enslaved people to seek refuge within Union forces. Even when allowed to enlist, black men often faced discrimination and were left to perform menial tasks. Once they were fully enlisted in segregated regiments, they became soldiers, but officer positions were often out of reach. Usually, regiments like the 54th, 55th, and the 5th Cavalry had white officers due to discrimination within the Army. They believed that only white officers were capable enough to lead men into battle. For women, they supported the Union Army in camps as cooks, nurses, and laundresses. They also acted as spies with enslaved domestic servants, often spying and divulging Confederate strategies. Most famously, Jefferson Davis's enslaved domestic servant divulged Confederate strategies and in her escape attempted to burn down the Confederate White House. We've talked about Harriet Tubman before and saw that she used her networks from the Underground Railroad to gain intelligence on enemy fortifications and movements. She was also the first American woman to lead a military operation in the raid on the Combahee River. Harriet Tubman's raid not only freed over 700 enslaved people, but also demonstrated the strategic importance of utilizing black operatives in military operations. There were also differences in contributions based on the region people came from. Enslaved people in the South fled slavery to join the Union war efforts. Up to 150,000 formerly enslaved people from the South fought in the Union Army. Shortly after Emancipation Proclamation was effective in 1863, about 50,000 people walked off their plantations and tried to find Union lines. Some enslaved people were forced to fight or serve the Confederate Army, especially early in the war. Enslavers would be paid the wages that the enslaved people earned in their time in the Army, but they were relegated to menial tasks. It wasn't until February 1865, just a few months before the end of the war, that the Confederate government considered and eventually approved enlisting black soldiers with the promise of emancipation at the end of the war. The Confederate decision to enlist black soldiers was a desperate measure, showing the severe manpower shortages they faced and the worsening outlook for the outcome of the war. Free African Americans in the North helped raise money for formerly enslaved refugees. Anytime there was a military campaign, many people would walk off their plantations and be liberated. In Sherman's March to the Sea or his Georgia campaign, nearly 10,000 refugees were created. Northerners like Elizabeth Keckley helped raise money and created the Contraband Relief Association to send money and supplies to those who needed it in the South. Some went south to establish schools and medical care. Susie King Taylor established a school in the Sea Islands of South Carolina. They also helped recruit new soldiers. The Black Committee, which included Frederick Douglass, Martin Delany, Charles Redmond, and Henry Highland Garnett, found men to enlist in regiments like the 54th. Frederick Douglass was instrumental in recruiting black soldiers, using his influence and oratory skills to inspire many to join the fight for freedom. Eventually, 2 of his sons also enlisted to serve the Union. Another prominent black activist was Alfred M. Greene, who early in the war in 1861 gave a speech titled, "Let Us Take Up the Sword," trying to convince African Americans to end slavery. Here's a little background on the demographics of the service members. About 200,000 total served, and approximately 180,000 served in the Army, making up 10% of the total Army, and 17,000 served in the Navy, making up 20% of the total Navy. 50,000 of the black service members were from the North, and 150,000 were formerly enslaved. They were either liberated during the Civil War by Union troops or fled their plantations after the Emancipation Proclamation. The high casualty rate among black soldiers highlights the harsh conditions and discrimination they faced, even as they fought for their freedom and that of others. 50,000 of the 750,000 total who died in the war were black, and they died at 3 times the rate of white soldiers. This was sometimes due to their lack of access to medical care and the types of work they were doing. They were also more likely to be killed rather than taken prisoner in the event that they lost a battle. The second learning objective is to describe African American soldiers' motivation for enlisting during the United States Civil War and the inequalities they faced. Their motivations included a desire to demonstrate their worth as U.S. citizens. There are many accounts of observers and other soldiers commenting on the valor and character that black soldiers showed. They were also statistically less likely to desert than white soldiers, primarily because this was more of an existential struggle for black soldiers than for white soldiers. They also stood up to inequities inside the armed forces as best they could. They received lower pay during the Civil War. White privates in the Army earned $13 a month, while black privates earned $10 a month. To protest this inequality, the 54th Massachusetts Regiment refused their pay until they received equal pay with white soldiers. In another instance, Sergeant William Walker of the 3rd South Carolina Volunteers convinced his company of black soldiers to protest low pay and lay down their arms. For this, he was convicted of mutiny in 1864 and was executed. The pay disparity issue was a major point of contention and a symbol of the broader struggle for equality faced by black soldiers. Some more inequities faced by black soldiers included being initially excluded from serving in the war because they were thought to be inferior or unable to fight effectively. This was despite black soldiers having participated in all major wars prior to the Civil War, including the War of 1812 and the Revolutionary War. The policy was changed for practical purposes rather than ideological ones. The Union wanted to strengthen its forces and weaken the Confederate forces by removing the workforce on plantations that could potentially join the Union Army. In the Navy, black service members served in integrated crews but encountered rampant discrimination. They were called derogatory names, paid less, and assigned the hardest and filthiest tasks. On the new steamships, they were in charge of shoveling coal and maintaining the boilers, usually in very cramped and hot conditions. Black soldiers also enrolled under unequal conditions, knowing they would be paid less than their white counterparts. When the pay gap was fixed by Congress, it was only for those who had joined as free men, meaning enslaved persons did not receive back pay for the inequities they experienced. The fact that Congress only fixed the pay gap for free men highlights the persistent racial inequalities even within the Union's policies. Black soldiers were said to have fought more vigorously and were less likely to give up because if caught by the Confederate Army, they risked enslavement and death. Confederate troops were more likely to kill surrendered black troops. The federal government's attempt to counter this was General Order No. 11, which stated that for any black soldier killed by the Confederacy after being taken as a prisoner of war, the federal government would also execute a Confederate soldier. And for every black soldier re-enslaved after being taken as a prisoner of war, a Confederate soldier would be put to hard labor. Despite being granted that authority, the federal government did not fully utilize this power. After a loss at Fort Pillow, Confederate soldiers massacred about 300 black soldiers after they had surrendered. One of the Confederate soldiers in charge there was Nathaniel Bedford Forrest, the future founder of the KKK. And after the massacre, the federal government promised to hold those soldiers accountable, but there was never an investigation, and the powers under General Order 11 were not exercised. The Fort Pillow massacre remains a stark example of the brutal treatment black soldiers faced and the failure of the federal government to enforce protections. The last learning objective is to explain how black soldier service affected black communities during and after the United States Civil War. Free black communities in the North during the war experienced anti-black violence by opponents of black citizenship and political equality. Before the Emancipation Proclamation was even announced, there were riots in Cincinnati and Brooklyn because black workers were being used as scabs or replacement workers against striking workers. There were also opponents to the military service in 1863 when the U.S. government increased the draft. In New York City, Irish immigrants were angry at the prospect of having to go to war for what they perceived as a war that would only benefit black people. They beat and lynched black people on the streets, burned down an orphanage, burned down churches, and vandalized stores that hired black workers. These opponents were made up of Irish immigrants and white working class men who were angry about the conditions they felt they had to pay for and the draft law that allowed rich men to buy replacements and evade it altogether. The New York City draft riots were among the bloodiest civil disturbances in American history and highlighted the racial tensions of the period. For example, after the war, General Sherman issued Special Field Order 15, which would have given confiscated territory to formerly enslaved people in the state of Georgia. This is where the phrase 40 acres and a mule derives from, but it was reversed by Congress because they did not think it could be constitutional. The reversal of Special Field Order 15 was a significant setback for the newly freed African Americans, stripping them of promised economic resources. Additionally, African Americans wrote poetry and took photographs to preserve and archive their participation in the war, documenting the dignity and sacrifice of black soldiers. You can see that in the portraits on the screen. The top one is of a washerwoman who worked in the camps, and the bottom one is a soldier. They also wrote songs like the Song of Emancipation. Finally, to recap, thousands of free and enslaved African Americans from the North and South joined the Union war effort. Participation in the war differed by gender, region, and status. African Americans endured inequities in their service to the Union during the Civil War. Free black communities in the North experienced violence and discrimination. And finally, black soldiers took pride in their service, documented in photographs, poetry, and songs. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushlights.com/afam. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.